Pete Souza Show this week, we have a guest, Amy Trask. I have forever been fascinated with the Raiders, with Al Davis, with the logo, with the autumn wind is a Raider. The John Facenda, the NFL Films aspect of it all, Lester Hayes, John Matuzak, you name it, Jim Plunkett, back to Kenny Stabler. Should I just keep naming these people like I have an issue? I'm not going to anymore. Amy Trask was in the front office with Al Davis. A woman in an NFL front office in, I think it was the mid-'80s, early 80s maybe? She tells us all about that. Working with Al Davis, and it shows what kind of a renegade Al was, the type of man he was, the type of integrity he had and belief in himself that he had, that he was going to hire a woman. It didn't matter what that looked like. She is one of my favorite people in all of pro sports and was kind enough to give us this interview. We're going back for this one because it's summertime, and we haven't taken a week off since March. So this is not a week off. This is a new interview. I can't guarantee, but I almost can promise you haven't heard it. And there's a story in here about the Super Bowl and Barrett Robbins disappearing that she says she's never told before. I mean, come on, if that's not enough. Amy Trask. When you first came on my radar, I was a kid. I went to Richmond and I was working for this company called SFX Sports, and we recruited athletes to get drafted, and there was also a scouting service arm to it, and it was called the War Room Football Scouts. Now it's Football Scouts, and it's with ESPN. But this guy Gary Horton ran the War Room, and I remember we were talking about Gary was in the front office with the Browns and the Buccaneers, and we were talking about front offices in the NFL. And he told me, he's like, yeah, Al Davis's right-hand man or woman is Amy Trask. She's a female. And I remember it was 1999. My mind was blown. And that was the first time. I'd always loved and respected Al Davis. And at that moment, he just got cooler. And I just thought it was such an interesting thing that a guy like that would be leaning on a woman. You were there for 30 years with the Raiders.
Almost. And thank you for sharing that story with me. You were gracious enough to allow me to participate without you being able to see me right now. But if you could see me, I'm covered in goosebumps. Thank you for sharing that. And you hit the nail on the head as to Al. And what I often share with people, because there will be those who are listening to this who love the Raiders, those who hate the Raiders, those who loved Al, those who couldn't stand Al. But if we're all being intellectually honest, whether you like the Raiders or not, whether you loved Al or not, he did what we hope everyone would do, which is hire without regard to race or gender or ethnicity or any other differentiation, any other characteristic or trait that has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on whether one can do a job. I guess the way I would phrase it a bit more accurately is any individuality which has no bearing whatsoever on whether one can do a job. And he was doing this decades and decades and decades before this was even a topic of discussion. When you said that when you identified when it was you started your career, I thought, uh-oh, is this your way of telling me I'm really old? But the fact is, and the reason I note that is Al was doing this decades and decades and decades ago.
What, with you, Tom Flores, right? Art Shell.
Yep.
And this was stuff that, look, I think it's obviously the right thing to do is to hire in regard to not taking into consideration gender, race, individuality. But it wasn't like it is today back then. And he did, like most things, I would assume, he just didn't care what other people thought.
Well, you're right, and you're right. It was not a topic back then, let alone something that happened with any sort of regularity in any industry back then. When I first joined the Raiders, well, I joined in the sort of early part of the mid-'80s, so before the mid-'80s, but not right in at the start, as an intern. And I was an intern for a couple years. And then I started my full time career with the Raiders, or I started on a full time basis in the mid 80s.
Yeah.
When I walked into my first league owners meeting, I was the only woman in the room. It was very different back there. There's terrific women in the room now. Women were added to the room over the course of the almost 30 years I spent with the league. But that first meeting, I was the only woman in the room, and he didn't care what anyone thought.
And that brings me to the makeup of Amy Trask. How do you comport yourself in a room with all men? And we're not talking about you just walked into 7-Eleven and there's 30 guys and you're the only woman. These are multimillionaires at the time, right? And these are alpha males. How do you operate in a room with guys like that?
Well, I always note before I answer any sort of question like this that the best advice I ever received in my life was from my mom, who told me as a very little girl, to thine own self be true. And she told me that over and over and over, as moms can do and as kids can do. I rolled my eyes every time she did. And as a side note, it wasn't until I was in college that I learned that that was a Shakespearean quote, that my mom didn't invent that. But it is the best advice I've ever received. And the reason I note that is I will share with you how I comported myself and how I, address situations like that. But I recognize that that's not going to be the right answer for everyone. Each and every person has to comport himself, herself in the manner true to himself or herself. My answer is I didn't care. I didn't care what anyone thought. Al hired me. I was there with Al. It didn't matter to me what anyone else thought, whether they thought I should be in the room or not in the room. It never made any sense to me. It still doesn't. For me to spend any time thinking about my gender when I was in any given situation, if my hope and my expectation was that no one else would think about my gender. If I wanted to walk into a meeting, whether a business meeting, an NFL meeting, a meeting of municipal leaders or bankers or Raider ownership or league ownership or a locker room meeting, any sort of meeting, and I didn't think anyone should be thinking about my gender if I didn't want them thinking about it, I didn't think it made sense for me to think about it. And by the way, if other people wanted to waste their time thinking about it, go ahead, waste your time. I'm not wasting mine.
How about the situation you write about this in your book? I've heard you talk about it. When the league, or I guess, yeah, the league is suing the Raiders at the time. And you guys were in and out of court for Al wanted to be a renegade and he wanted to do things his way. And there was a vision there. And you're at a meeting and I guess you're going back and forth with Carmen Policy. And the commissioner at the time tells you to have a seat and you don't sit down.
Well, first of all, anyone who knows me knows that telling me to do something, telling me not to do something, that's a better way to phrase it. Telling me not to do something is just going to compel me to do it. You tell me not to talk, I'm talking. You tell me to sit down, I'm not sitting down. I mean, that's my personality, but it also wasn't the right thing to do at the time. But before I answer that, I want to let you know how much I appreciate. I could jump through this connection and hug you for noting accurately that it was the league that sued the Raiders, because I am such a child that for the rest of my born days, anytime someone references that litigation, I immediately sound like, a 5-year-old saying, Mom, they started it. They started it. We were the defendant. And no, not a lot of people recognize that. So thank you very much, because now I don't have to say, Mom, they started it. I remember well the moment you're talking about. Carmen got up and he said some things. They weren't personal as to me. They weren't directed at me, but they were directed at the organization for which I worked. They were directed at the Raiders. They were directed at Al. He was not at the meeting. It was a one per club meeting, and I was there representing the Raiders. He chose not to go. Or if it was a 2 per club meeting, maybe someone else was there, but Al was not. And Carmen spoke, and then I stood up. And the way things worked in league meetings is when you wanted to speak, you stood up and you walked up to a microphone. So as Carmen appeared to be finishing, I stood up and I walked to a microphone and I started addressing his comments. And Tagliabue said, we've taken enough time on this. Please sit down. Well, I wasn't done. So I didn't sit down. I said, I'm not through making my comments. I won't take a long time. And I just refused to sit down. And the whole room was dead silent. And he was staring at me and I wouldn't sit down. And he finally said, okay, just finish quickly. So I made my point and then I sat down. I never thought that was a big deal. It never struck me that that was something that others would think was a big deal. He told me to sit down. I wasn't done talking. I wasn't going to sit down until I was. So I finished. But apparently it caused quite the little ripple in the room.
What kind of ripple?
People, one team owner came up to me on the way out the door because right after we were sort of done with that segment of the meeting, we went to take a break. And he said, "You popped my buttons." And he said it in a way that suggested that was a good thing, although I'd never heard that expression before. A number of people contacted Al and said, "She didn't sit down. You should have seen her. She didn't sit down." And I don't know whether they were saying that to him in a manner like, wow, that girl didn't sit down, or whether they were saying, Al, really, you need to get a grip on her. You need to, tell her to sit when she's told to sit. I don't know in what context, but he could not have been more proud that I maintained my position and didn't sit down.
He was a guy that one of the reasons I was such a fan. He just stood for stuff, and I got the idea that when he stood for something, it was pretty hard to move him off that position. How do you, Amy Trask, win an argument with Al Davis? You were always somebody who had his ear, who heard him out, or he heard you out.
I love that question for so many reasons because you're absolutely right. He had the courage of his convictions and he was willing to stand for that which he believed. A very quick anecdote in that regard before I answer your question was back before, many, many, many decades ago, decades before I joined the team. There were two instances in which one was a Raider game and one was an all-star game that he was involved with. And the games were scheduled for the part of the country where segregation still was the case. And he refused to play the games and he got the games moved. And he did it just because that's the man he was. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because he was not going to play in a segregated environment. And my favorite story is in one instance, the person arranging the game called him and said, okay, the arrangements are made. We've got 2 hotels for you. And he said, I don't need hotels. We don't need 2 hotels. We don't have that many people in our traveling party. And the person said, no, 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 no. We have 2 hotels for you. And he said again, getting impatient, look, I told you, we don't need 2 hotels. And the person then sort of mumbled and stumbled that the black players and the white players could not stay in the same hotel. And Al said, oh, I gotcha. I gotcha. And the person sort of breathed a sigh of relief and said, oh, okay, you understand. He said, yeah, I understand. We're not playing. And click, hung up the phone and got the game moved. And I share that because this is a man who stood up for what he believed. The biggest misconception about him, to address your question, is that one couldn't argue with him. The biggest misconception was that he wouldn't tolerate argument, he wouldn't tolerate disagreement, and he wouldn't tolerate those who disagreed with him. If that was the case, I would have been fired roughly 2 weeks into my job. And over the course of those almost 30 years, I disagreed with him more than I agreed with him. And we had loud, because we both had loud voices, robust arguments, and we disagreed a lot. And I did all I could do to change his mind. And in the instances in which I didn't, which were many, I recognized at the end of the day, he owned the business. I did not. And so ultimately, the decision was his, and it was my job to effectuate that decision as best I could. But it was also my job, in my view, to disagree with him when I disagreed.
Where did you get the backbone or the gumption? Where did that come from? I am by nature a people pleaser. I've never loved confrontation. I've never loved confrontation, but some people thrive in it, and it's very effective. How did you develop that? I would call it a skill.
Well, I don't think I thrive in confrontation. And I think the word that my entire family and everyone who has known me for my life would use wouldn't be gumption, it would be behavior problem. That's what I was labeled in kindergarten. My kindergarten teacher told my mom I was a behavior problem. That label stuck with me every year of elementary school and junior high and pretty much most of high school. I think until the end of high school, a lot of people would tell you that it's still the appropriate way to describe me. what one might have considered a behavior problem, I simply considered questioning when questioning was correct. And even if that occurred in kindergarten, if someone told me to do something, if I didn't think it made sense, if I didn't agree with it, I didn't do it.
Kind of thinking on your own. Not enough people do that still today.
I can't say it wasn't a challenge for my family being told I was a behavior problem in kindergarten, but I can say that's probably something that attracted Al to me from a hiring standpoint. And as he advanced me, I think our personalities meshed well in that regard.
A couple more things for you. The Raiders were known as outlaws, and it was kind of like, hey, you come to play. It really doesn't matter what you do off the field. How true was that?
Oh, I'm sorry, finish your question.
No,
I'm so excited by your question. I jumped on your words, so please
no,
finish.
go ahead. I always go back, and this is before you were with the team. I remember, but this carried on. I mean, throughout Al's legacy and with the Raiders, the Eagles go to New Orleans and they don't leave their hotel room for Super Bowl 15. And the Raiders notoriously are like all over New Orleans. There's a million stories about those guys, Matuzak and you name it, Ted Hendricks. Was that real, and was that part of the Raider image?
Not only was it real, it's what attracted me to the Raiders as a franchise. It's why I became a fan. It's one of the two reasons I became a fan. I fell in love with the game of football in eighth grade, but I didn't have a particular team for which I rooted. I was a fan of the game. I watched the NFL. Seventh grade, I'm sorry, I said eighth. I don't know why I said that. When I started junior high, seventh grade is when I fell in love with the game of football. I don't know where the heck eighth came from. Uh, and then I went away to college. I went to Cal Berkeley, and the Raiders at the time were in Oakland. It's before Al moved the team. And I fell in love with the Raiders. That became my team for a couple of reasons. One of the two reasons was the one you just identified. You'd turn on games, watch them on TV, and you would see video footage of the visiting team getting out of the bus at the stadium in which they were going to play. And the players got out of the bus and they were wearing sports coat and carrying what looked to be briefcases. And then you'd watch the Raiders, and the team bus would roll up, the door would open, and men just spilled out. They tumbled out. They were wearing what clearly looked like what they were wearing the night before. They weren't wearing sports coats. They weren't wearing ties. They tumbled out of the bus looking like, well, that expression, what the cat dragged in. And so one of the reasons I fell in love with the team was what you just described as to the New Orleans situation. Other teams locked in their hotel room, pulling up to the game in sports coats, and the Raiders just tumbling out and playing. And that was Al's view. And that gets to the larger reason why I fell in love with the team. This was a team who gave people second chances and third chances, in some instances more than that. This was a team who gave chances to players other teams would not. This was a team owner who believed you show up, you contribute, you participate, you make us better. I don't care what you're wearing. I don't care what your reputation is. You want to tumble out of the bus looking like something the cat dragged in. That's fine. I don't care about your race. I don't care about your beliefs. I don't care about your religion. You're going to contribute.
Yeah, and it's one of me. Part of my story, a big part of my story, is I'm 11 years sober, right? So I've gotten many second chances, and by the way, the coin we have in the group I'm in, the 12-step group, it says on it. The only words are "to thine own self be true." And
wow.
that is, yeah, it's so that's a huge part of my life. But the second chances are major, and it doesn't matter. If you're on the complete right side of the law or you're a total outlaw, you're somewhere in the middle. It always seemed like you had a place with the Raiders if you got the job done.
And there were a couple of things he wouldn't tolerate. I'll get to that in a minute, but I will tell you one of the things that resonated with me about him giving second chances was I was that kid who was labeled the behavior problem in kindergarten. And that label did stick with me throughout high school. And as I noted, it probably is still an appropriate label. So there were times teachers and principals called my parents in umpteen times, she's going to be suspended. You better be careful or we're going to expel her. So I got second chances in the school situation, but that second chances resonated with me. Now, that said, there were some things Al wouldn't tolerate. He would not sign someone who engaged in domestic violence or certain other crimes. So, yes, he gave people second chances for the sorts of things we're discussing that you identified, that I identified. But he too had his line, but it involved criminal behavior.
Wow, that is interesting. I did not know that. All right, how about 2004? You have a sponsorship, I guess, with Star Wars and Darth Vader, and it's one of the every May 4th I get to see following Amy Trask on Twitter. I get to see the Darth Vader or read the Darth Vader story, and I see the picture. Take folks behind that curtain. It's one of my favorites.
And it is the stone cold truth. I have not added to it for purposes of social media. There's no hyperbole. This is precisely what happened. And of course, as you know, to share this with you on your show, I'm going to have to swear. So here it comes. And it's a quote. We did a promotion with Lucasfilms and Star Wars, and at the game, Darth Vader came fully in costume, and the
fully Darth Vader,
fully Darth Vader, and the guys in white, I think they're called stormtroopers.
Yes,
but they were all lining the field, and at one point before the game begins, it's warm-ups. Al was always on the sideline for as long as his health allowed him to be, pre-game, watching warm-ups, talking to coaches, talking to players. And someone with Lucasfilms approached me and said, we'd love to get an opportunity for Al to greet Darth Vader. We'd love to take a photo. I said, well, first of all, it's not going to be a photo op because I ain't going to be able to get him to pose. But, I heard what the sponsor was saying, and it was an important sponsorship to us and a fun sponsorship. It's not something teams did at the time. And the person in charge of the sponsorship for Lucasfilms said, could you get Al to greet Darth? So
and you're the CEO.
Walked up to Al. I'm sorry?
And you're the CEO. So this is,
yes,
yeah.
Yes. Yes. So I walked up to, I thought you were asking if Darth was the CEO. And I'm like, yeah, I guess Darth was the CEO of what he did.
For sure.
I walked up to Al on the sideline and I said, I need you to greet Darth Vader. I didn't ask him. I didn't say, will you? I just said, I need you to greet Darth Vader. And he gives me this look. I can picture it just right now in my mind and in my heart. He just gives me this look. Like, you're interrupting me while I'm watching warm-ups. And he says, the only words he says to me are, who the fuck is Darth Vader? But you know what? He walked with me over to Darth, who was a few yards behind him on the sideline, greeted Darth, shook Darth's hand, and he walked back to watch warm-ups.
And the picture, by the way, is unbelievable. It's an unbelievable picture.
And I love when fans and my Twitter village, as I refer to it, has responded to me. I bet Darth was frightened of Al, or who in this picture looks scarier, Darth or Al? And, obviously the answer is Al.
And it's funny because the Raiders were kind of synonymous with Darth Vader. And, they call the place in Vegas now the Death Star because it was always, they were just both badass,
Right. But who the fuck is Darth Vader were the only words he said. But he did it. He knew it was important, or I wouldn't have been asking.
Unbelievable. Last thing, not many people talk about this, and I'm just curious to get whatever you can share with on this topic. Because we talked about Super Bowls or the Super Bowl 15. What was it like on the ground floor when Barrett Robbins disappeared in 2002, 2003?
Wow. You're one of the only people that's ever asked me that. So you are one of the only people, and I believe possibly the only person with whom I've shared this publicly. That morning I went for a run. Yeah, I may have shared this with one or two other people. I just don't think I have, and I certainly haven't shared it widely. That morning I went for a run before, I'm an early bird, as we discussed, and I went for a run. And as I was coming back into the hotel, I saw Barrett in the lobby. So yes, he had been missing for a period of time, but it's early, the morning of the Super Bowl, well earlier than the team wake-up call. And he's in the lobby, and we exchanged hellos, seemed absolutely fine to me. Went back up to my room, and Al calls, and he said, Bruce and Bill don't want Al, aren't going to let Barrett play. Bruce being Bruce Allen, Bill being Bill Callahan, the head coach at the time. Bruce was the GM at the time. He said he spoke to Bruce and Allen, and he spoke to Bruce, and Bruce and Bill had decided to send Barrett back to Oakland, that he was not going to be able to play in the
At
game.
the time when you saw him, you were like, oh, there he is. But it's not your job to be like, hey, Barrett, where you been?
No, but I'm like, Barrett, are you okay? Barrett,
Okay.
Barrett. I thought what was most important, because where I ran into him, he was getting into the elevator, I thought what was most important to get him up to his room.
Okay.
And I also didn't think that was the time for the discussion. There would be a time for it. That moment was, in my view, not the right time. But Al called and said Bruce, who I mentioned, the GM at the time, and Bill, the head coach, had decided not to let Barrett play in the game. And I said, I just saw him. He's fine. And Al told me they didn't think he was up. They didn't think he should play in the game. They didn't want him in the game. And I said, he's fine. I was just with him. I was just having a conversation. He can play. And Al explained to me that he left the decision up to the two of them, and the two of them had decided that he shouldn't play. And I got off the phone and I looked at my husband and I said, we just lost this game.
And you did lose that game. And that's an amazing story. And how big of an impact did that have on the field? This is your center.
Huge, huge. And not only was it our center, the Super Bowl was the first game all season we played in which the same 5 starting offensive linemen didn't play. That's extremely rare, as you know, due to injury. But that season, all 5 offensive linemen started every game. So that game, the Super Bowl, would be the only disruption in that continuity. And I knew the impact it would have, not only because of the skill Barrett brought to the game, but because of the trust that the quarterback had in Barrett, the confidence that Barrett gave the quarterback and the rest of the line.
Do you think he could have played?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Was what he did that week right? No, it wasn't. But there were medical issues for what he did. I thought he needed our support. I thought he needed us to be helping him, not casting him aside. And I also, when a team, and this is beyond the Raiders, when a team makes a decision to discipline a player and not to play that player, there needs to be a recognition that you're disciplining that player, but in your effort to do so, you're hurting every other player. You're hurting every other member of the organization, or you can be. I shouldn't say that's the case in every instance. Certainly in our instance, the decision to discipline Barrett by sending him home dramatically impacted every single person in the organization and every single fan.
When you think of the magnitude of a Super Bowl, forever.
Forever.
Oh, Amy Trask, I can't thank you enough for the time. I appreciate you so much.
We are Rogue Media Sports.